Hi everyone, I'm Liam Eagle. I'm the editor at the Web Host Industry Review, and I'd like to welcome you all to another of our WHIR webinars. Today's session is called the Hybrid DNS Model, One Size Does Not Fit All, and also introducing iView, Full Visibility of Network Activity in One Place. It's going to feature a presentation by Doug Miller, who is Director of Product Marketing at Nominum. I'm going to turn it over to Doug in a few minutes and let him introduce himself properly. But before we do that, I'd like to mention just a few quick housekeeping type items. First of all, questions. There is going to be a period at the end where Doug will answer some questions from the audience. But you can feel free to submit those questions throughout the presentation using the webinar's submit questions function, and those questions will be saved for the end of the webinar. I spoke to Doug a little earlier also, and he said that if you'd like a copy of the slides from today's presentation, please use the contact info that will be posted during the Q&A session to contact Nominum, and you can ask them for the slides. And finally, I'd like to remind everyone that there will be a video archive of the webinar online at the WHIR.com/webinars early next week, along with a lot of other great past webinars. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Doug and make him the presenter here. Doug, do you want to introduce yourself to the people?
So yes, thanks, Liam. My name is Doug Miller. I'm responsible for product marketing over here at Nominum, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some of our hosting capabilities, and as Liam said, the hybrid DNS model for hosting. So we're going to go through a few different things here. If there are questions that come up, just to reiterate what Liam said, feel free to go ahead and chat those over to us. And as we go through them, if there's something that's specific that I can address right away, I will definitely do that. But most likely, as Liam said, I will hold most of those questions until the end of the presentation. But again, feel free to chat as we go through here. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump right on in. So as far as an agenda goes for today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Nominum just so you know who we are, and then I'm going to talk about the problem that you guys as hosting providers are facing today and how you have the ability to address it today, and more importantly, how you may be able to address those challenges tomorrow. Finally, we've got a quick slide on the TCO and business impact of the whole thing, and then we'll get to a Q&A. So before I jump into the Nominum introduction, please do understand that a lot of the things you're going to see here have a lot of Nominum names, and it's the way we present our materials. I'm going to do my best to keep this educational as opposed to a sales pitch, but understand that we think of things in a certain way over here, so as I go through certain topics and use our product names, know that I'm doing that as an educational means and not to try and sell you any of our products here on this phone call. So without further ado, a little bit about what we do here at Nominum. So our mission as a company is to make the internet smarter, faster, and safer for really all users on a network, and those users could be broadband and mobile users across the world. In the case of this call today, it could be your customers that are using your hosting services, but which is a little different than some other companies you might see, is that we're really focused on the end user, the end customer experience, and in doing so, what that does is puts you guys as providers in a better light with your customers. So a little bit about Nominum. There's really three ways that we typically differentiate ourselves. From a technical aspect, we do a lot in terms of a layered approach, multiple operational modes. You guys can read the words on the screen. I'm not going to talk too much about that in this presentation today. The thing that we're going to focus on is the solution diversity. So as opposed to just basic DNS caching or basic authoritative services, I'm going to talk to you about the differences between in-net and off-net, and more importantly, combined hybrid models. As a company, we offer hosted solutions as well as consumer applications. And then finally, in the third tier, you can call it, is we have some operational differences that make us a little bit more unique than other customers as well, or other providers in this space. A lot of it is because of our pedigree in this industry, is that we've got over 500 million end users on our network, representing about 130 or 140 customers, and darn near 30% of the world's internet traffic that are going through our software. What's also interesting is that our chairman and chief scientist, Dr. Paul Makapetris, is the one that invented the DNS many, many years ago, and he still is very active at Nominum. We've got a rich history in the open source community. We have principal architects here that were the lead architects in Bind 8 and Bind 9. So as we go through this and as we talk about how some of these hybrid models work and how Bind does certain things versus how we do certain things, know very well that we don't necessarily have any problems with the open source community. We're very deeply embedded in the open source community from our history. We just do things a little differently. So some of our customers you see down there, some of the largest carriers and enterprises in the world, So rest assured that as we go through this presentation that you are hearing from a company that's got a vast history in this space. This isn't something we just built in our garage a few weeks ago and we're offering it commercially today. So moving on, Nominum has a few core offerings, which we'll talk about a few today. We have in-network software systems, which is primarily anchored by our Vantio caching name server and our ANS and ANSP authoritative name servers. We'll talk primarily around the authoritative name servers for this call today. We have hosted network services that consist of a variety of Sky-branded services, as well as our iView information service. For the purposes of the call today, we're going to be focused on the authoritative side as well as the iView side. And just to round out the product offerings, we have a consumer application that is used for redirecting internet service requests that would normally result in errors. So moving on to the problem that you guys are facing today. Let me start off by thinking about this in a way that our customers will typically think about it. So why does the DNS matter? And you can see there that, simply put, the way your customers think, not necessarily you as a hosting company, but your customers, that the DNS is your brand, is their brand, and they are entrusting their brand with you as a hosting provider. So they need to maintain that uptime. They need to maintain the ability to get quick resolution. They need to be able to maintain all the full functionality and full features to take care of that brand, and they're trusting you with that. And you guys are working with the community, with the vendor community, the open source community, to find solutions to ensure that that brand is always safe. They can't afford to gamble with their brand, which means that neither can you. And that's why the DNS is so important. So without the DNS, that chain is irrevocably broken. So you really need to make sure that that DNS is solid and is always maintained. So moving on. The things that are likely keeping you guys awake at night. These are the problems facing you as hosting providers. Clearly at the top of the list is reliability. Domains absolutely have to be up 100% of the time. You can't have downtime. You can't have domains going offline for some period of minutes or hours. Scalability and performance. Now, of course, you need to know that you've got to be able to support a certain number of queries or a certain number of zones. You've got to be able to cope with the increases in both good and bad traffic. But you've also got to consider that as you size your networks, that you need to make sure that you account for not only the good and the bad, but spikes in traffic associated with denial of service. So you may have your network set up to do a maximum of 10,000 queries per second or so many queries per day or per year, but have you accounted for the denial of service? Have you accounted for the attacks on your network? That goes to the next point, the security. What happens when you are attacked? Your domain must be protected. The domains you're hosting must be protected, not just from attack, not just from attack from denial of service, but also cache poisoning, a very big problem. A big problem that's been getting a lot of press over the last number of years and will continue to do so. And finally, the cost. There's a variety of investment options out there. There's commercial options like what Nominum provides. There's open source options. You can deploy the software directly into your network. You can do it in a hosted type of manner. There's a variety of ways you can address the cost, but the one right solution for your partners or the people that you work with or your competitors may not be the same one that's right for you. And that's what the purpose of this webinar is all about, is to try and find the things that are the most interesting for you and the most relevant for you. Moving on. The way we address the challenges today are going to be different than the way we do it tomorrow. So today, you have primarily a suite of in-network options. The software is built and dropped into your network, whether that's authoritative solutions, whether those are caching solutions for potentially mail service. There's going to be a variety of things that you may install in your network. Now, typically, the in-network option, typically this is done with providers that own their entire data centers and own the infrastructure. That may or may not be you guys on the phone. That may be a combination of different types of folks. Then there's the off-network options. Those are completely software-based, and they're hosted in someone else's network by a third party. Now, this is going to be right for some people and not right for some people, but it's typically, and I say typically but not always, chosen by providers where the infrastructure is not readily available, is not something that they can actually completely own. Now, why would you choose one versus the other? Now, the ROI models are going to be different for different types of companies. You may be a very, very large hosting provider and still choose to roll all this off to somebody else's network. You may have a distributed geography, and that's something where you don't want to have multiple data centers set up so you go off network. You may have a skill set that is very, very perfect for managing your own authoritative servers. So you may want to keep things on network or in network. The problem is that once you've chosen a path, once you've chosen to go in network, or once you've chosen to offload all of the traffic to somebody else's network, it's really very difficult to change back to another direction. It's really difficult to start as an in-network and then drop all your stuff all at once off onto a hosting provider. And again, these are some of the things we'll talk about today. So keeping up with the new technology, that's always going to be a challenge. So as you're considering options, DNSSEC and cache poisoning, how will you prevent any kind of damages to your domain? How will you prevent attacks on your domains or on the zones that you guys are hosting? So DNSSEC, is it here today? Is it going to be coming tomorrow? These are all questions that the industry is asking. And the true answer is that nobody really knows how long it's going to take. But you have to be prepared for DNSSEC. Cache poisoning, these are problems that were very prevalent a number of years ago and more recently in the last couple of years, and they're not going away. So there have to be solutions to address the cache poisoning, whether that's DNSSEC going forward or solutions today. IPv6. As a hosting provider, that may or may not be something you guys are thinking about right now, but I can promise you this, whether it happens today or it happens next week, it will be happening, and it's going to be coming more and more in the coming weeks and coming months and the coming year. That is for sure. Denial of service and distributed denial of service. Do you have the mechanisms in place and the defenses in place to handle these attacks? So it's not just cache poisoning that you're worried about. You need to make sure that A, that your infrastructure can sustain these attacks, and B, that your infrastructure can also prevent the attacks. Multi-mastering, or something that you guys might know by other names, dual active masters. Is your domain always available? Is your domain data, are your zones always available? We'll talk about that as well. So the ability to have dual active masters, or what we call multi-mastering, ensures that that information is always up and running and always available. These are the challenges you need to deal with. And then finally, distributed management. How will you grow your DNS footprint, and how will you grow the management of that larger DNS footprint, especially with an in-network solution where the software is loaded directly into your data centers? The larger your networks get and the more zones that you host, the more difficult it becomes to manage those zones. So going forward and moving into tomorrow, these are the things that you guys have to look forward to tomorrow. So now you don't just have those two options. Sure, you still have the in-network solutions, and sure, you still have the options for the off-network solutions, but no longer are you forced into, hey, I'm just kind of a small hosting provider. In-network's just not the right solution for me. Or you know what? I really would love to offload some of my traffic, but that's really just for the small guys, and I'm a big hosting provider. Those aren't just the two options anymore. Now there's a third option. There's a hybrid model that you need to consider. The hybrid model allows you to take the best of both worlds, and we'll describe all the different scenarios where you can do that, where a combination of in-network and off-network components can be used.
What we're trying to suggest here is now you've got the ability to grow from and between these models. So you may choose to offload some traffic and not all the traffic. We'll get into those details a little later. But also have the options to support the functionality is more vital. So now management and reporting. You've got to have, with a combined in-network and off-network, all the supporting functionality is even more complex and things that you have to consider. So now in terms of management, what, do you use a portal? Do you use command line? Do you use APIs? Do you use all the above? Now the static options is going to be much easier. There's typically one simple way or one reasonably simple way to get the work done. With the hybrid model, much more complex and much more confusing if not handled properly. So great, you've got the added flexibility, but you need to be sure that you manage it properly. And again, these are the things that we'll talk about on the call today. So ease of use as well. So in terms of ease of use, what you've got to have is a series of management APIs. So you've got to be able to control the software over multiple DNS systems that may be in-network and that may be off-network. And of course, it would be great if these APIs were obviously provided in a similar fashion, that you weren't choosing two wholly separate communication paths. And in terms of the communication systems, you've got to have the ability to communicate out via authoritative servers. Now, here's where I readily apologize that we're going to start to use some of our own branding, again, because this is the way we think about these things. But communicating information out of your authoritative servers, what we call our ANS Premier, our Authoritative Name Server Premier. So the ability to manage also becomes much easier with zone configuration templates. So as you're starting to run multiple zones, hundreds of zones, thousands of zones, or potentially are provisioning, say, 100 or 500 zones a day, most of these zones will have similar types of configurations. You need a name server, you need an MX server, you need www records, you need SOA records. The last thing you want to do is be able to have to do the same thing over and over again hundreds of times a day. To be able to use configuration templates allows you not only to provision those things faster, but also it allows you to not have to store redundant information. It's a single configuration template. Now again, this will become much, much more relevant as you're trying to manage between on-network and off-network types of environments. And then finally, you see there the ability to do zone versioning, zone rollbacks, and diffs. What this does is gives you the complete control over the data management. So it's really a way to go back in time. If you want to actually go back to a state of the network that you had previously, whether that's 30 seconds ago or potentially hours or days ago, it gives you the ability to roll back where you were before. If a mistake was made, if there was some kind of catastrophic failure, the ability to recover data and go back is going to be very vital. And the ability to do that over in-network and off-network environments has to be seamless. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. DNSSEC. I've mentioned that to be a challenge. And fear not, I'm not going to read all of the words on this slide, but anyone that has some experience in DNSSEC knows that on the caching side, it's relatively straightforward. It's complex, but relatively straightforward. On the authoritative side, it's very complex. The key administration, the managing the signing of zones, and the updating of zones when the data changes is going to be something that requires a ton of administration. So as you're considering options, and even if DNSSEC is 6 months or a year and a half away for you, consider these things. DNSSEC can be a huge burden to your operations in terms of management. Now DNSSEC itself is based on an RFC, so the actual inner functioning of it is going to be no different from vendor to vendor, but the administration is going to be very complex. So just to give you an idea of what we do is we put together a variety of what we call DNSSEC packs that allows you to automate all of these functions by using just 1 or 2 different keystrokes as opposed to going literally over pages and pages of command line. So again, then signing and re-signing zones is CPU intensive, and the database size is something you've got to consider. Again, for those of you that don't have a lot of experience with DNSSEC, the records will grow much larger. Your database requirements and your storage, you can see there, can grow up to 6 times as much as the DNSSEC zones are signed. So keep in mind all of these things as you're addressing new solutions. Now, multi-mastering. This is something that's going to be interesting for everyone. What you may know this as commonly called in the industry as dual active masters. Nominum calls this multi-mastering. But just to give you a sense of the differences, if you have one master authoritative server that you store all of your zone information in, and for some reason that master goes down, that all of the slaves will be without updates for as long as that master is down. Now, dual active masters makes it a little bit better. What that does is it allows the dual active masters to sync. So you may have a data center in New York and one in Los Angeles where you can sync the data together by some kind of queries, some kind of commands. But even still, if one goes down during the middle of an update, some of that information will not be present in the other master. So if you make updates in a single master, the syncing process is not always going to be in real time. So consider as you do this, as you offload some of this traffic, some of the authoritative traffic, the master traffic, into a hosted environment, multi-mastering ensures that they are always out of sync. There is no manual syncing process, that the slaves will always have access to one of the masters even if one of them goes down. So that ensures there's no single point of failure. There's always some kind of active master that the slaves can go to. Complete redundancy. It ensures that all of the authoritative servers out in the network are able to get their information in a very clear and clean manner and is always up to date. So consider the multi-mastering as one of the very primary things that you'll have to look at, primarily in a hosted environment, but also in a hybrid environment. So moving on, visibility and awareness. This is something that's going to be very near and dear to you as a hosting provider. Of course, managing zones is something that's important, but don't forget about the reporting aspect. So you can see the bullet there at the top. Without the visibility, you're flying blind. So you really want to have the flexibility and the capability to create events for reporting purposes or generate alerts based on any variety of attributes. So setting a threshold about a certain number of queries, setting a threshold on query types, understanding what the query IDs are looking like, the result codes are looking like, the IP version, knowing what the top domains and the customers are doing on your network. What types of customers are actually generating anomalous activity? If there's a denial of service going on in your network, is it potentially coming from one customer? So these are the things you need to know. So graphical reporting options, setting watermarks, whether they're high or low, alerting via SNMP, or better yet, potentially alerting via this iView interface here, which is what we're announcing actually this week. It's a new product we just announced yesterday. I've got a couple slides to go over that. But keep in mind as we go through, the purpose of an interface is not solely management. Management is key, absolutely. Management is something you understand, but it's also the ability to report on the activity within the network to create a better service and a better brand for your customers. So what is iView? And forgive me for taking a couple seconds to introduce this, but this is going to be a new concept for most of you out there, I would guess, is that iView is an information service that we provide here at Nominum that allows you to do a hosted reporting on anything that's going on in your network. You saw some of the statistics from the slide before, so you can see what kind of traffic is coming in. You can see the domains that are generating the most activity, the IP addresses coming in and making requests to those domains and those zones which are generating the most activity. Who are your top producing customers? What are the total number of queries that you're generating per day, per week, per hour? This kind of information not only helps you understand what customers are doing, but this is the kind of information that will better help you understand how you're using your own network. So in doing so, the ability to pull information not just from the network, but also from in-network software as well as hosted network software. So bringing all of that information together in one place is what allows you to be able to manage a hybrid environment. Without an application or an interface or a service like this, whether it's iView from Nominum or something else, you need to have that visibility over both the in-network and off-network to truly manage a hybrid offering. And that's what iView brings. So some of the questions customers are asking that you need to be able to answer, whether it's a hybrid model, a completely in-network, or an off-network model, is what are some of the things that are happening on my network? Who are the top customers? What are the top domains or destinations? Where should I potentially change my network routing? Is one of my load balancers putting too much pressure on one of my authoritative servers? Should I offload the traffic somewhere else? What are the top threats on the network? Where are the domains coming from that are creating the most traffic? There are any number of questions that you as hosting providers must be able to answer. And having, again, whether it's an iView service from Nominum or some type of service that allows you to report on traffic is going to be vital. So without it, all you're doing is making best guesses. How are you going to maneuver around the competition without real data from your network? Your business is blind. You need real data to create real models and real business cases. And this allows you to do that. Rather than relying on an industry report that says that DNS traffic is going to go up at 10% a year or 50% a year or 100% per month in the next 3 months, you need to rely on your own network, on your own hosted network to be able to do some of these things. And that's what this information service will provide. So what does it look like? And now, realistically, this integrating with NPS, which is another one of Nominum's services, is something that you may or may not be focused on as a hosting provider of network security. However, know that this information service takes information from a variety of different sources within Nominum. So whether it's just hosting information or whether it's caching information or even other application information, knowing the information is the key to succeeding. Now, for the purposes of Sky Authority, which is our hosted service, and again, I'm using our brand names, but remember this is the way we look at things over here, is that any type of information service or interface that you see has to give you the information that you need the most. So whether it's QPS stats or response codes or domains access or top clients or trending reports, the information has to be readily available for you to make these decisions. You've also got to be able to manage the environment, something you know very well as hosting providers, that management is key. So adding and deleting zones, adding TTLs or SOA information, this is the kind of information that you need to understand. But the clearly important message that I want to get across on this one slide is the visibility into customer activity. As a hosting provider, you have anywhere from dozens to hundreds or even thousands or millions of customers. What you need to do is be able to know what's happening with each one of those customers and have the ability to treat them uniquely when it's appropriate. And having this type of information via an information service is what will give you that ability. So let's move into some of the hybrid models now, and I'll show you a couple of graphical examples of this. So in terms of in-network and hosted authoritative DNS, the foundation for these services is going to be the software. So whether you use some kind of open source or commercial solution, and in our case that's ANSP software, there are certain things that you need to consider, whether it's hosted or whether it's in-network. The software, of course, has to be extremely high performance. The processing speed and latency are going to be key to managing your network. You must have the 100% uptime, must have it. The multi-layered DDoS protection, the automated DNSSEC support, whether it's in-network or off-network, all of these things have to be addressed for any type of authoritative solution you have. Now, specifically, moving the software into a hosted environment, the high availability becomes even more important because now all of a sudden you lose some element of control. So it needs to be highly available. It needs to be high speed. So via Nominum's Anycast network, the traffic is actually routed through any one of 13 data centers worldwide via that Anycast network. So at any given time, it's like the biggest, most massive multi-mastering solution that you could ever imagine. If one data center goes down, another data center picks it up. Completely seamless. So all of the hosted information, all of the zone information is completely secure and always up 100% of the time. The real-time visibility and management, we've already talked about iView, but you also need APIs to actually automatically create and manage these zones. That must be something you consider as you move into a hosted environment. And finally, flexible TCO. This is something we talked about earlier in the presentation. So whether it's saving on server expenses or deciding to roll some of the traffic into a network, any type of hosted network, or keep some of the space, some of the hosted traffic in your own network, you've got to consider what are the important things, what are the true operational expenses that you need to consider as you move into a hosted model. It's going to cost, the cost structure is going to be different, but now you don't have to worry about power and space and cooling. So these are the things you need to consider as you move into the hosted environment. So from a purely hosted option, fully outsourced DNS traffic. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to need to have the ability to manage any of your traffic via an in-network web-based portal. So whether all of your traffic is off-network or not, you must have the ability to manage it within your own network. So having some kind of interface and a secure web administrative portal to do the reporting and to do the actual changes is something that you must have. The changes must be published instantly. And then when the traffic is completely hosted in an authoritative environment like a hosted network, now you have the ability to offload all of the traffic, whether it's the masters and the slaves or all of it completely 100% hosted in a third-party network. So even when that traffic is in the network, outside of your network, but in the hosted environment, you still need to be able to manage the ability to delegate the entire authoritative DNS. You need to propagate zone and resource record information, and you need to make sure that it's completely secure and reliable, even though it's not on a network which you maintain. Now, the more interesting side of this is going to be on the hybrid side. So there's going to be a hidden master in-net and slaves off-net. This is something that we found a lot of our customers are considering today. So they want to have the masters on their network, on their own corporate network. They want to control that. But they don't want to do all the hosting on their network. That's something that we have, which this is the perfect example of the hybrid model. So you maintain 100% of the full management and control of the DNS in your network, a full multi-mastering environment in your network, complete architectural flexibility, and management via the authoritative software that's in someone else's network, which is our network. So what happens now is now you put all of the zone information, all of the actual hosted, all of the slaves are going to be in an off network, in our hosted network or a hosted network. Now what you need to do that is you need to ensure that the zone transfers are obviously completely secure. You've got to be able to set it up not only to manage but also to report through a web portal. So there's a variety of different management and reporting functions that you need, but it absolutely must be seamless between the corporate network and the hosted network. So whether the information is hosted completely on your network in a completely in-network option, or whether it's hosted completely as an off-network option, the difference should be completely irrelevant and completely transparent to you from a management perspective. It is still your data as a hosting provider. It is still something that you need to control. And the hybrid option must allow you to do that. Okay? So we will move on. So in terms of TCO, what we found is that there's a variety of costs that you need to consider. We already talked about power and cooling and data connectivity and all of those things. Those are obviously things you need to consider. And consider them in terms of whether it makes more sense to have it in-network or off-network. But also remember that your capacity and your network is increasing. So even as you use the data in-network, there will be off-network costs associated with hosting some of these zones. Does it make sense to put most of the cost in the hosting environment? Does it make sense to put most of the cost in the in-network? But we have a graph in there that shows that with a real customer, we did a study, that if they started it in year 1 with 100% of their operational and management expenses, year 1, that by year 4, just 3 years later, that those costs went up over 250% from the first year. So we're not talking about growth that's like 50, 100, and 200% year over year. We're talking about relatively reasonable amounts of growth, 10%, 15%, 20% annual growth. But the costs associated with that grow so much faster. A lot of that has to do with actually enabling other data centers. More customers means more data centers, more zone information. DNSSEC, there's going to be a much greater storage and management cost. There's going to be a much greater administrative cost. So as the networks get larger and as traffic gets more complex, it goes back to one of the earlier slides that I had, as IPv6 comes out, as DNSSEC comes out, as these new functions come out, and as network traffic grows, the capacity that you need to maintain will grow exponentially, even if your customer base is only growing at a geometric rate. So keep in mind these things, that going forward, even if you're completely in network now, that a hosted model may make sense going forward. Or if you're completely hosted now and want to bring some of that information back into your network for management reasons, where you have the masters in network and all the hosted zones off network. These are things in business models that you must consider, and the expenses associated with those will go along with it. But I am going to go ahead and open up to question and answer and see if we've got any questions out there. I've got a few that I'll go through, and as I'm responding to these questions, feel free to ask a few more, and then I'll go ahead and wrap up and turn it back over to Liam. Okay, so the first question I want to cover is, do I have to, let me read this correctly, do I have to have Nominum software in-network to use a hybrid solution? Do I have to have Nominum in-network software to use a hybrid solution? The answer is absolutely not. So if you're using some other type of in-network authoritative solution, that does not mean that you cannot undertake a hybrid solution with Nominum or anyone else for that matter. So if you have in-network bind servers or in-network bind software or some other solution, you want to have all of the mastering, the authoritative masters hosted, or vice versa. If you want to host all the masters in your own network and offload all the zone information into a hosted model, you absolutely can do that. Okay. Unfortunately, I can't see if you guys are nodding your heads or if you're understanding the answer, so if there's questions, please do chat those over to us. All right, I've got another question here. I'm going to go ahead and read this. Can I move to off-net for part of my zones, or do cutovers have to be complete? So the answer to that question, and I'll repeat it again, do I have to move all of my traffic over to a hosted model if I only want to move part? And the answer is, of course, you can go ahead and move bits and pieces as you see fit. So you can move all or part of your zones to a hosted model over time. So if it's something where you want to have a partial zone information in Nominum's network or some other network, absolutely you can do that. So Nominum's global network can host all of your zones, or if you want to have some kind of rollout of the information, you can definitely do that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and answer this last question unless someone else has others. It says here, I'm using bind. Are there any cost advantages associated with a hybrid or off-net model? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read into this question. I think that the question is all about, if I'm using bind, it's free, why would I ever want to go into a hosted model? And I assume that that's the question that's being asked. And if that is the case, there absolutely are still plenty of cost advantages to moving from an in-network open source solution to a hosted model or a hybrid model. As you guys are all very well aware, hosting even free software has operating costs associated with it, capital costs of managing servers. Like I mentioned in one of the previous slides, power and cooling. So software licenses are not the only reason that you would want to actually have a hosted model. So there are definitely quite a few costs, and what we've seen in terms of both managing and operating in-network software, there is a huge cost advantage to moving a lot of that off-network into a hosted model. Not necessarily all of it, and that's the reason of this. And that's the reason that we have a hybrid model, is because in some cases, there are reasons to have some in-network and some off-network. But the short answer to the question is, just because a certain solution in-network is open source or conceivably free, there really is no such thing as free, and a hosted model is really something that would be an interesting thing to look into. Okay? I'd love to know if these questions or any comments or feedback on any of the questions. But again, via a virtual interface like this, a web-related model, it doesn't quite work that way. So I don't think I have any more questions that are relevant for a larger audience, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up with this here that says if you've got any more questions or if you're looking for information, or, and I would encourage you to do this, to register for a free product demonstration of our new iView product and the ability to manage and report, I would encourage you to contact David WHIR. His information is right there. His phone number is 650-381-6024. Email is david.whacker@nominum.com, and he will be happy to answer all of your questions. And with that, it looks like, Liam, we're probably going to finish a little bit early, so I will pass it over to you.
Hey, Doug, since we have a few minutes left, I'd love to, if I could, just follow up on that second question you answered, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you had said that there are sort of a few hybrid scenarios, and the example you used earlier in the presentation was the, the in-network master and the hosted slaves. Are there very commonly used first steps into the hybrid model, or are there all kinds of different hybrid models you can take as a sort of first step into the?
It's a good question. It's not really necessarily going to be a first step type of mentality. It's not like, hey, I just want to kind of get my feet wet, and so I'm going to take the master here and I'm going to offload all the hosted traffic somewhere else. It's really more that, hey, from a management perspective, my core competency as a hosting provider is really managing and provisioning zones. The actual bit about authoritative traffic and being able to manage authoritative servers, not really necessarily a hosting provider's expertise. So it's not like really dipping your toe into the water by doing that one model that I suggested. That's typically the most common solution that people will look at. However, very much like what I was talking about, the third question that was asked about a bind user, that is there any cost advantages to moving some of my traffic over? The answer is absolutely yes. If you want to actually truly dip your toes into the water and say, I'd really like to offload some of my traffic. I'd really like to offload some zones for geographical redundancy, or because I really don't want to have a data center that supports so many queries or so many zones. That's another type of hybrid model. So rather than thinking about it from a master and slave perspective, just offloading some of your zones to a hosted model is probably more of a dipping your toe in the water type of mentality. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Okay. Before we wrap up, it looks like someone else might have asked a question. So there was a question about price, and obviously this is not probably the right venue to get into pricing. You guys can talk to David WHIR about that. But I will tell you, as with any other type of hosted service, it's a model that will be much like that, where it's a subscription type of model, or it's a query based on queries resolved, or a queries per second type of model, or queries sent to us type of model. So that's probably about as much as I want to get into in terms of price, but I want to make sure that question didn't get left off. Sorry about that, Liam. If there's any other questions you have, I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, I was very interested when you mentioned the IPv6 briefly in the sort of the broader discussion, because I thought that it was. It's like you mentioned when you mentioned it, that a lot of hosts, aren't necessarily thinking about it right now, but it is something that they're going to have to think about. I would love it if you could give some more detail on it. What exactly the hosted DNS product brings to the table as far as managing the IPv6 world.
Yeah, it's a good question, and very much like DNSSEC starts with the authoritative and kind of bleeds into the caching, I would argue, probably improperly so, but I would argue it's just the opposite for IPv6. That IPv6, the bigger problem is going to be on the caching side, whether to know to ask for an IPv6 record or an IPv4 record. So it's kind of a backwards argument to my DNSSEC discussion a little bit earlier. But most of the things that's going to drive a provider to move to IPv6 or IPv6 types of addresses are going to be when the caching starts to move to that direction. And by the way, that is not a final indefinite answer. That is not if you get the technical folks on the line, they'll tell you, hey, that's not completely true. And I readily admit that it is not completely true. But the answer is that really the caching, and when the IPv4 addresses are, like I said, starting to run out, moving to IPv6, networks will start to move to IPv6 addressing schemes, in which case authoritative providers or hosting providers for authoritative service must be able to address an IPv6 request. Now, that won't be anytime today or tomorrow. It's not going to be like, for instance, if the whole network, say a large service provider, said we're going to go ahead and move to IPv6 tomorrow, it just wouldn't make sense to say that certain hosts or certain domains or zones will not be available on the internet if they don't carry an IPv6 addressing scheme. It just wouldn't make sense for a service provider to force that issue. So it's really going to be a transition. And it's going to be a transition that even as a hosting provider, the authoritative software must be able to address both of them. So is it something that's going to happen next week? No. But do you need to have the ability going forward to be able to move and transition from not only IPv4, but a dual stack IPv4, IPv6 environment, and eventually some number of probably years out solely an IPv6 environment? So not as immediate as a DNSSEC thing, not as complex possibly as a DNSSEC thing, but something that still is going to be a requirement in authoritative software going forward, and something also that will differentiate the customers on this phone call, that will differentiate the hosting providers to be able to tell their customers that we are fully IPv6 ready. We can respond to queries both on IPv4 and IPv6, and furthermore, we are fully DNSSEC compliant and ready to go. So I don't know if that answers your question, Liam, but it's kind of a reverse argument from the DNSSEC.
Okay, it did answer my question though. I think that was
Great.
Interesting to look at. So I don't personally have any more questions. I don't know if you want to maybe wrap things up a little bit early now.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just wrap it up and tell everyone that thanks for the time on the call. I apologize for a couple of the technical glitches. It appears we're having some phone issues here at our facility. But if there are any questions, again, I encourage you to talk to David WHIR. The last thing I will just wrap up in this presentation is that the ability to host your customers' domains is something that they are putting a whole lot of faith in really their business. And I don't want to oversell the point, but they are trusting their online businesses to you as a hosting provider. And there is nothing more sacred than their brand. And to be able to go back to your customers and say, we are ensuring your brand with the best software and the best security and the best network and the best cost options available on the market is something that absolutely is something that hosting providers should consider and that customers will be thankful that they have. And with that, I will wrap it up.
Okay, well, I'd like to reiterate Doug's thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks for submitting questions, and thank you for bearing with the brief technical difficulty. And of course, I'd like to thank Doug a lot for shining a light on something that maybe isn't, as well understood within the hosting business as it could.